Hello, so I'm here with my friend Justine Brown, friend and author, I should say, because I think we've covered a number of your books in the time I've been doing YouTube. It's really been great, and I've really enjoyed them. I haven't read this particular one, but Justin Brown's going to walk us through it because it's on a topic that we are both very interested in, which is the reign of James II and the Jacobites. I think maybe the Jacobites don't come into it, but thanks for coming on, Justine.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm excited. Yeah, the Jacobites come into it in the sense that James was the founding member, I guess, of the Jacobites. The Jacobite cause started with his dethronement, and so it's derived from James is Jacobus in Latin. So it was he was the I mean, they actually used the term Jacobite as soon as he was dethroned, which is 1688.
Mhm.
And the whole, but we associate the term more with his son and grandson. So his son was James Francis Edward Stuart, um, also known as the Warming Pan Baby, also known as the Old Pretender, also known as King James the Third and Eighth. And most famously, Bonnie Prince Charlie,
Mine
who
was
was
Charles, yeah, who,
yeah,
who lost in the Battle of Inverness in the early 18th century.
he yes 1745. Culloden was the kind of last most bloody battle where Charles then escaped to Skye, apparently with the help of a lady. And he himself was dressed as a washerwoman or something like that. But yeah, so it's a romantic sort of history in a very specific way, in the sense that we associate the Stuarts with the kind of sacred, the ancient, the mysterious form of kingship that has been kind of stamped out. And many romantic authors, such as Walter Scott, for example, wrote about them, um, took up their cause, but almost as you know, as an already lost cause. So
Mhm.
a lot of people were nostalgic for this and kind of always associated with the Stuarts with this kind of always already, to use the structuralist terminology, always already lost cause. Um, and I I have noted elsewhere that Don Quixote is the master text of the 17th and 18th century, and
Mm.
because we have like the tension between the old romantic, chivalric tales, which are being mocked but also celebrated in Don Quixote, and it kind of underpins so many not like literary texts, but also historical events in this period, I think. And we see like Jacobites actually, later Jacobites consciously calling themselves like the Order of Del Toboso, for example, after Dulcinea del Toboso, who was Don Quixote's ideal lady love. And so they actually, even in the 1715 or so, they kind of had a sense of humor about this thing. So
Mhm. Yeah, I remember seeing that whole Jacobite thing in Walter Scott's Rob Roy, which people will remember being a movie in the 90s with, was it Liam Neeson?
that
I,
sounds right. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I can't quite remember the movie, but I found it weird because I'm pretty sure that Scott's politics were Whiggish, but he has this romanticism for the Jacobites, the people who are still loyal to the old world, essentially.
yeah. He did very much, like, because I mean, another thing is that we tend to associate Jacobitism with Scottish nationalism, broadly speaking, even though I think that's a kind of a misunderstanding of what the Jacobites were really trying to achieve. But Scott certainly, like, he was a fan of the old. At least he was a collector of the old ways of the Scots, and he associated the Jacobites with the old ways of the Scots. So um, I say that just because. I think if you asked a lot of people who was Bonnie Prince Charlie and what was he trying to achieve, a lot of people who are Scottish nationalists would say, well, he's trying to take over, just get independence for Scotland, maybe, or like be king of Scotland and maybe fight the English from from that position. But really, what he was trying to do is restore his father to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So that again was the son of James II. And I should add that one of the reasons that the Scots favored the Stuarts, not just that they were their royal family, which they were, but also um, James and Charles II favored the three kingdoms model, which is that one king ruled all three kingdoms, but there was no united kingdom like we have today, where Scotland and England. I mean, it's kind of gone back a little bit because now we reopened the Scottish Parliament, but Scotland and England became one single unit. And under Anne, Queen Anne, who was actually James's daughter, but kind of a bad daughter to him because she cooperated in his dethronement. But under her, Scotland and England became a single country officially. And but if the Stuarts had been restored, then they would have returned to this older model, which is more in line with with Catholic social teaching, for one thing, subsidiarity.
Well, that's also something that confuses people a lot about this period. We're talking about the Glorious Revolution because the Stuarts were known as Scottish kings and queens, but they were also known, perhaps incorrectly for some of them, as Catholic kings and queens. And that was one of the main propaganda reasons for William of Orange to kick off the Glorious Revolution, even though I don't know how much of that's actually real. It was sort of anti-Catholic sentiment. And what's even more bizarre is that Scotland is known for being a predominantly Protestant, like Covenanter, Calvinist type nation at the time.
Certainly in the lowlands, yeah, but the Highlanders, I believe, a lot of them were still Catholic. So that was the reason that they called Bonnie Prince Charlie, invited the Highlanders to fight with him, because a lot of them still conform to the old ways. Well, it's complicated because certainly James I, who was Mary Queen of Scots' son, he was the first one to rule England and Scotland at the same time, but there were still two separate parliaments. He was a Protestant. Charles I was a Protestant, though an Anglican, high church Anglican. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic. She was a French princess who was Catholic. And a lot of the Puritans who eventually executed Charles sort of attacked him as effectively a Catholic or a crypto Catholic, somebody who was being influenced by his wife, and not just that, but also favored the basically what they saw as relics of Catholicism, and in a sense they were, right, things within the Anglican Church that didn't change with Henry VIII's revolution, such as archbishops and bishops, beauty of holiness, as they termed it in Anglicanism, the sort of more emphasis on ceremonial, and incense, candles, robes, the sort of much more fulsome Catholic style, services. So the Puritans were, if most people know this, but some people don't know that we call Puritans because they were trying to purify the Anglican Church of its residual Catholic elements, or vestigial Catholicism. So Charles was Anglican, although he did, I mean, to be fair, like he did recognize that one of the reasons he wanted to keep the bishops in place was that it did provide for a possible eventual reunion with the Catholic Church if certain conditions were granted. So he was, in a sense, open to that. But on the other hand, he died, insisting, like he basically was a martyr to the Anglican faith, because he could have accepted a deal and to introduce Presbyterianism into England, which would mean getting rid of the bishops. but he did not accept that idea, and so that was one of the reasons he wound up being executed. Now, the big thing though is that James II did convert to Catholicism, and
Mm.
um, and Charles II did, but on his deathbed. Um,
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Wow.
yeah, it's a very the whole story of their sort of two ways of converting is very telling about their characters and uh, their political kind of, I guess, talents, right? Because Charles II, I mean, we have like a pretty accurate impression of his kind of character, being very humorous, cynical, a kind of political realist, very self-indulgent. He was the merry monarch who was restored in 1660. So he was James II's older brother.
Mm.
And he did have a private um, preference for Catholicism, but he recognized that it would be it would be massively politically unpopular if he were to convert. And he actually, in a secret treaty, he promised Louis XIV that he would become a Catholic eventually. And he he did eventually become a Catholic, but literally on his deathbed. Um, there's a very beautiful story about how that happened. James brought a priest who had, when Charles was escaping England during the English Civil Wars, this priest had saved his life, had hidden with him, had bathed his feet, had hidden with him in a priest hole or priest hide, actually. And this father was called Father Huddleston. And all those years later, and this was in it would be like 1651, after the Battle of Worcester. So it was the last battle of the English Civil War. And when Charles lost that against Cromwell, he had to escape England. He had it was a 2-month process. He had to get out in disguise. This would make an amazing film if anyone wants.
Yeah.
It's really good. But all those years later, when he was dying in 1685, James went out to find a priest to give him the Blessed Sacrament, um, and he found Father Huddleston, and he came into the room saying, "This always gets me. This good man once saved your life, sire. Now he comes to save your soul." Um,
Hmm.
and so it
Interesting.
was very, very beautiful. So Charles went out and in having confessed and having accepted the Catholic faith and took the Holy Sacrament, but James was a very different type of man, and he was a very sincere person, a very honest person, maybe too honest for his own good politically. And when he was Duke of York, which he was as brother to the king, that was his title, second in line, basically. In the early 1670s, he converted after reading a book about the Reformation by Reverend Peter Halen. And it's ironic in many ways, because he read this book just out of curiosity about the details of the English Reformation, which I guess he had a broad idea about, but he was curious. So Halen was trying to, I suppose he was trying to defend the Reformation, but the effect was like the opposite on James, because when James read the details about Henry VIII's reasons for breaking with the church, which famously had to do with him wanting to marry Anne Boleyn and
Yeah.
uh, get an get what we would call an annulment from his wife Catherine of Aragon, who had only managed to, well, she'd had many children, but they all died, with the exception of Princess Mary. Um, and Henry understandably wanted a male heir, but James saw this one sort of defensible reason for his, wanting to remarry. Um, he saw this, he termed this an unchristian way of begetting children, to force God's hand by, um, by breaking with the church and insisting on and giving effectively giving himself an annulment, right?
Yeah.
you know so James saw that. Okay, so first of all, the fact that he had been violently in love with Anne Boleyn uh, affected James, because James's personal vice was, as he called it, the forbidden love of women. And he knew that this was his Achilles heel was fooling around with women who weren't his wife. And he had a lot of mistresses and and a couple of wives, but many women. And he increasingly saw this as a real weakness in his character. And so then when how you sometimes, when you see people who have your own character failings, you condemn them more than
Yeah.
you might, it makes you uncomfortable. So seeing that, he saw himself in Henry, and he basically said, okay, this man, turned the country upside down because he was over lust, because this woman wouldn't give him, Anne Boleyn wouldn't become his mistress. She
Yeah.
wouldn't sleep with him, basically, unless, she became his wife. And he was
And
incensed.
it was irrelevant anyway, right? Because the line didn't even proceed through that generation. It went through Mary Queen of Scots.
Well, um, the that was a little bit later, because so Mary Queen of Scots had a very good claim coming out of Scotland, but Henry's
Hmm.
Henry's daughter also Mary. It's very confusing. So
Yeah, yeah. Mary
there's
Tudor and Mary Stuart.
yeah. Mary Tudor is also known as Bloody Mary,
Mm.
and that's a whole interesting subject in and of itself, and it actually does tie into James. I when I think about Whig history, which is something that we t- touch on quite a bit in these circles. And I'd like to sort of explain that term a little bit more and explore that term a little bit more for those people who don't know. But the Whig history sort of has three main villains in English history. They are Mary the First, who
Mm.
was the daughter of Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon, who eventually did come to the throne and was, uh, intent on bringing the English back to Catholicism. I mean, she did have a bunch of people burned at the stake. That is a fact. However, when you compare her to other monarchs, such as her own father or Elizabeth I, her crimes are not
Yeah.
much different, right?
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
just
That's
depends
little
on who.
known.
Yeah.
It's a little known fact of this period is, Bloody Mary wasn't uniquely bloody. This was the war of religions. Everyone was doing it.
Everyone was doing this stuff. Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth I had many English Catholic priests hung, drawn, and quartered, just for being priests, not for being involved in plots against the state per se, right?
Mhm.
Many people died extremely violently. Her record is shocking as well. So yeah, so as we know, history, famously, of course, written by the winners. And so certain people get away with certain things. And Henry VIII, I mean, I consider him, once he kind of turned, he became one of the great tyrants of history. Prior to that, he was, he seemed to be a pretty good king, but
Mhm.
he was an extremely bloody person. He put down the Pilgrimage of Faith, which was um, the northern sort of protesters against the break with the Catholic Church. He put down men, women, and children indiscriminately. He killed many people. So Mary was not a sort of outlier, put it that way. But so we have Mary, the sort of villains of Whig history are Mary, Charles the First, who was James the Second's father,
Mhm.
and James the Second. Um, and and they always are sort of portrayed as in the progress of history, where we move from the bad old ways to the wonderful ways we have now. The people, the kings who kind of resisted that progress, as it's described, who tried to maintain, I guess, altar and throne politics, or resisted the efforts of Parliament to become sovereign. Those are the bad people, right? And they're depicted as the stubborn resistors of the people's natural desire to, for democracy or whatever,
For
right?
self-governance, yeah.
Yeah. Um, what we mean by Whig and Tory actually turns around James II himself. So we would have no Whig and Tory without James, and we would have no modern party system without Whigs and Tories. They were the two factions of Parliament that responded to James's conversion with, well, neither of them were particularly happy with James's conversion. The Tories thought that they weren't happy. The Tories tended to be the Anglican. They're also known as the Court Party. The Anglican used to be the Cavaliers, who supported the old structures, the kind of traditional structures, but were Anglicans for the most part. So for them, they weren't so happy he became Catholic, but for them, what really mattered was that he was the legitimate heir to the throne. And he was the legitimate heir to the throne because Charles II didn't have any legitimate offspring. He had lots of illegitimate offspring, like a crowd of them. But
There's people online do how many actors currently are direct descendants of Charles II?
oh,
Yeah, there's scores of them, right? Like a huge chunk of the Game of Thrones cast are direct
yes,
descendants of
Kit
Charles II.
Harington.
I think his wife is too,
Oh,
weirdly
really?
enough. Yeah.
Well, interestingly, so was Diana Spencer. Diana Spencer was descended from both Charles and James, both brothers, through their mistresses, and supposedly that's one reason that the Windsors wanted her to marry the current king, because she had this lineage, right? And that made, because they are aware of the Stuart problem, as it were, right? Um, the Windsors don't want to be replaced by this Jacobite heir, but they, still have like regard for the lineage, and also they know that confers some kind of legitimacy, at least in a folk kind of way. And so, if William comes to the throne, he will be the first to be descended from James II, albeit on the wrong side of the sheets.
Interesting.
So just to cover the Whigs and Tories, these two, they were both nicknames for, like, it basically meant cattle rustler, but two different Gaelic terms for cattle rustler, and they were like terms of insult for each other. So the Whigs opposed James's inheriting from Charles on the grounds that he had converted to Catholicism, and the Tories supported him becoming a king, because even though they weren't happy with his conversion, they still felt that the lineage was what mattered, the tradition was what mattered, the legitimacy was what mattered. And so that's why, I mean, it's true that the people who opposed the Jacobites emphasized Catholicism a lot, whether, because even though it's true that James was a Catholic, it's true his son was a Catholic, but those two, they wanted to make the Catholicism part outweigh the legitimist part, right? So they focused on that heavily, and at the time there was no barrier to a Catholic coming to the throne. that legal barrier was introduced when James was deposed.
Mm.
And so the Whigs, all through the late 1670s and early 1680s, were in a total lather trying to get this kind of like get him excluded, and this is called the exclusion crisis. So they were very, very whipped up, and they were constantly, I mean, there was nonstop accusations. I mean, there's a whole thing called the Popish plot, which was a hoax. They pretended that there was a plot to kill the king and put James on the throne. And then again, like loads of Catholics were executed in that period. They had constant like mock Catholic parades through London, and they would burn everything. It was like November 5th, every day of the year.
Oh, okay. It's so amazing how that whole period is sort of airbrushed out of our consciousness of history. People are aware of the English Civil War, and then history kind of fast forwards all the way to the Georgist kind of period that
Yes.
is in the mid to late 18th century. So it's kind of interesting how that whole period is kind of not forgotten, but it's just not emphasized at all.
Well, I think there's the reason for that is that the present order is based on that. Certainly in Britain, right? The present
Mm.
order that we have is based on his having been dethroned. And it's an awkward fact in a lot of ways still, because we still do, at least, I mean, there is a residual, if you have any kind of affection for monarchy, there is a residual belief in, the legitimate heir, right?
Mm.
And there's no question that he was kicked off the throne, and his son, and this is like the sort of most horrible part, is that the reason the thing that brought about the crisis that kicked him off the throne finally after 3 years was that his wife gave birth to a son, and whereas that normally is the thing, like for I always mentally twin James with Henry VIII because of this like connection to his conversion, and the fact that he consciously wanted to heal the rift, but interestingly, James did not. Like, another thing that people sort of represent him as being this hot-headed Catholic who wanted to force everybody to be Catholic again. This actually was not true. He had a very well thought out concept of a religious toleration. I don't know how realistic it was, but he certainly articulated this idea, which Charles had actually promised, and he was restored. So it was part of the restoration project, but the Parliament would never let it go through. And the idea was that
Mm.
there would be a religious toleration. In other words, like all Catholics, but also Protestant dissenters and others potentially would be legal, provided that they didn't threaten the state.
Mm.
And James had this idea, which he called mere religion, or mere conscience, and it's not how we think of mere, like only or something. It's pure. So
Mm.
that if a person has a pure belief, which it's just that person has come to these conclusions, and he had a real because of his own conversion, he had on the one hand, he was a absolutely devout and convicted Catholic. On the other hand, he made space for people who had not arrived at that same conclusion. He was
Yeah.
best friends with William Penn, for example, the famous Quaker.
Interesting.
And the two of them would make they actually made a lecture tour through England to try to promote this toleration project. And James famously said that he compared conscience to complexion, which to our, people immediately think of race, but I think James, to be fair, I think he was just talking about like different, complexions that Englishmen might have, like some more, a little bit more, ruddy than
Yeah.
others,
Yeah.
whatever. But he was saying that he felt that, putting someone in jail because of their conscience is kind of like chucking them in jail because they are and he actually used the word black, but in those days, black just meant a dark haired person with dark hair, dark eyes. And for example, Charles II was called a black man, black. This has actually led to a few people claiming that Charles II was like, African.
Yeah, I think there's been a few things like that that have appeared on Netflix.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of. I mean, it kind of brings up. I don't know if you already did make this transition yet, but I mean, this sort of anti-Catholic. The papists are coming to reinstitute Bloody Mary's reign. This is obviously the propaganda efforts of William of Orange, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. What's and I don't know. I mean, do you know anything about his secret motivations? Because to my position, it always feels like William of Orange wanted to institute a parliament that was supreme over the king, and this whole religious angle was kind of faint in that direction. But I don't know. I'm not studied on this, so what's your take on this interaction?
So I'll just comment briefly on the Mary part first, and then
Sure
talk
thing.
about.
Yeah.
So it's true that William and the Whigs, who were like, there was a kind of hardcore Whiggish settlement in Holland, and whenever they would get in trouble for having a rebellion against Charles or James, they would end up over there, and it's true that they wrote pamphlets about Mary and said that, like, because James had converted and there was this prospect of a Catholic coming to the throne, it was going to be a return to the battle days of, and apparently this is when the term Bloody Mary actually was invented. So it wasn't invented under the Elizabethans. It's not to say that she wasn't reviled in by I believe Fox's Martyrs, which was a book that was kept in churches alongside the Bible. So yeah,
Mhm.
book about like Protestant martyrs, and that included the people who had been executed under her for refusing to recant their Protestantism. They were given a lot of chances to recant, but they were
Mhm.
very sincere. So, but so that actual term, which has like come down the ages, but the fact that we know her as Bloody Mary tells us how much the Whig sensibility is still active, I think. So they invented the term then, and there was there were all these pamphlets about Bloody Mary and reminding you how it was under Bloody Mary, and that James was for sure going to be like burning everyone at the stake. Um, Now, and again, James like had arrived at a kind of liberal, point of view. He thought that it was possible to, have this uh, freedom of religion, and he said he wanted to lead by example, and he said he wanted to be a good father to the people. He did want them to convert to his religion, but he wasn't going to force them. He wanted to set a good example. That was his position, which kind of unimpeachable. I mean, this like idea that he wanted to he was a convicted, a real sincere Catholic, and he wanted people to convert, but he wasn't going to force them to convert. And he was just going to
Mhm.
try to set a good example. And he was going to allow Protestant dissenters to practice freely, as they hadn't been able to for a long time. Um, so William and Co. and William was working like he pretended he was actually the son-in-law and nephew of James II. So his James's daughter Mary, which is it throws another Mary into the mix, but he had Mary and Anne were his daughters who had been raised
Mhm.
Protestant at Charles II's insistence, so that they be these Protestant heirs, so that people couldn't there wouldn't be um, too much hysteria, which was, the Whigs were constantly whipping up the London crowd to try to get everybody worried and angry at all times. So um, his elder daughter was married off to William of Orange, who was his nephew and his um, his son-in-law. So he was the son of one of James's sisters. But he was very Dutch, and he was very Calvinist. And his main motivation was to uh, that he wanted to fight Louis XIV, and Holland and France were constantly at war in this period. A lot of it was because what modern day Belgium was kind of, the Spanish were retreating out of there, and it was kind of up for grabs. So the land between Holland and France was kind of in flux. And so he was mainly concerned about fighting off Louis XIV. And throughout this whole period, the English kings were divided between, or trying to sort of play off the Dutch and the French against each other. Like, shall we be allied to the French or allied to the Dutch, right? And both of them were closely related, actually. Louis XIV was also their first cousin. But William's main motivation in becoming King of England was to use English resources to fight the French. And he brought in, when he came in, he invaded England in 1688, in November 1688, and he chose November 5th to land, famously, referencing Guy Fawkes, because that was the time of year when Protestants were most up in arms against Catholics.
So Guy Fawkes Day was not a product of the Glorious Revolution. It was known before.
Yeah,
I kind of figured that Guy Fawkes Day was, like Thanksgiving. I figured it was instituted after the Glorious Revolution. That's interesting.
It was still a popular sort of day, and you did have like popes being burnt in effigy and things, but it was very much like used for propaganda purposes. And William was an excellent propagandist. He also had the help of one John Locke, who was part of a rebellion against Charles II called the Rye House Plot. And when the Rye House Plot was discovered, and some people, including another famous thinker whose name has just escaped me for a second, but a lot of American revolutionaries reference him, as well as John Locke. Come to me in a sec, I think. Locke was already, he was already making his arguments against Filmer's position in Patriarcha, which is essentially that the king is like a father to his people. There is no free human subject that just decides to join a society. You're born into it's like you're born into a polis, like you're born into a family. Mm-hmm. So it's very much not only does it reify the traditional family, but also kingship as fatherhood, essentially. So Filmer's idea, which is quite convincing to my mind, and a lot of people celebrated it, especially those in the sort of more cavalier or traditionalist camp, the Tory camp. Locke wrote his most famous arguments in response to Filmer's argument. So he wanted to dispense with the idea that we are just born into a polis and we don't choose it, and this idea of the sort of atomized human subject. I mean, I may be oversimplifying Locke, but like that, these are a lot of the ideas that come down from Locke, right? Like
and it also kind of feels a little bit like Hobbes is mixed in there too, right?
Yeah.
The whole state of nature, and then this idea that like you get more bang for your buck in society, and this is the basis of the Christian Commonwealth type deal.
Yeah, Hobbes is like he always seems like a combination of the two, in the sense that on the one hand, he seems very pro, like a strong king, but he imagines society as something that, is, you're in the state of nature and then you decide to participate in society, kind of thing. Whereas Filmer said that you don't decide, you're born into this life, right? You're born into, you're helpless. You're born into a family. Your father is your king. Your king, the king is your king, right? And you don't choose, and it's silly to think that you do. So this very fatherly model of kingship, this is what was at stake during, especially during the 17th century. These kind of, you have Parliament trying to increase their power, become sovereign, which they succeeded in doing, um, and you have the sort of Stuart kings trying to follow a sort of older model of kingship. But at the same time, I think that I mean, Chesterton put this very well. He said that that Henry VIII unwittingly weakened the monarchy because first of all, he got rid of the Catholic Church, which was in a special relationship with the monarchy that reified it, but also, you know, it didn't concentrate so much power in one person that that person then became sort of in a weird way fragile because there's two, it's but also because Henry VIII's second big thing was to dissolve the monasteries and redistribute the land. And he redistributed the land as a way of buying support for his new model that made him this kind of Caesar, Pope figure. And so he redistributed the land, thereby empowering a group of people who prior to this they weren't the old nobility. Most of them were kind of gentry who then got more land and therefore more political power, because in order to vote, you had to be a landowner. So the number of landowners was expanded over the period between Henry VIII and, let's say, Charles I.
Mm.
And famously, like a really good example that shows what happened is that Oliver Cromwell, the great Puritan, you know, a great, but famous Puritan leader who became the ruler in the Republic period. He was the great grandnephew of Thomas Cromwell. And Thomas Cromwell was the man who came up with the whole dissolve the monasteries and redistribute the land concept. So
Mm.
Oliver Cromwell, two generations later, benefited from his uncle's actions, and he is a case in point, right? He would have never been an MP if it wasn't for this redistribution of land and so forth. So what Chesterton said effectively, that having having looted the church in the 16th century, the next generation then saw that they could turn around and loot the monarchy. So they could do the same thing. They could use the power and land that they had gained by looting the church to then challenge the monarchy, right? So Henry may have thought he was expanding power, but he was actually weakening the monarchy long term.
Yeah. He was kicking with the support structures.
Yeah, and strengthening the parliament and making those people more. So they kind of went from a model where, as I understand it, parliament was not called all that often during, even like Elizabeth's reign. I think parliament was called 4 times. It was not, they were not expecting normally to be just constantly there, having input on everything.
Yeah.
Um, but under, they went from this kind of more harmonious model where Parliament was expected to advise the king on what was happening in the land and maybe vote him some money if he wanted to go to war or something like that. But after by the 17th century, the model had become much more conflict based, where Parliament was constantly fighting with the king. And so Charles I and Charles II dismissed Parliament for long periods of time, which the Puritans they regarded this as tyranny. It was actually a very peaceful time, and under Charles I, it was known by the Royalist camp as this wonderful period of peace and calm and plenty, but by the Puritans describe the same period as the 11 Years' Tyranny. So yeah, and then Charles II, he got so tired of the Whigs trying to exclude James from the succession that he eventually sent Parliament home, and he ruled as an absolute monarch for the last 4 years of his reign. So it's quite an interesting.
People are always saying that Charles III should dismiss Parliament and complete the pattern of Charles dismissing parliaments.
It would be brilliant. If only Charles III was. I mean, we're just hoping that he has the secret. You know, it always seems like now
Secret business.
yeah, secret. It's looking doubtful. But yeah, if he would ride in on a horse and dismiss Parliament, it would be so much better off, right?
Yeah. So I mean, to kind of refocus us on James II, because what do you think is really is the secret life of James II really his sort of supreme tolerance, like him being kind of a proto-liberal, his imagination being thoroughly sort of part of the Enlightenment, or is it sort of that the old sort of monarchy pre-18th century conception, that was kind of a pattern that was in many ways more hands-off than we might ordinarily assume?
Well, I think that the fact that he had this kind of somewhat liberal vision of a, I mean, it's kind of what's hidden actually about him. But I don't think I wouldn't call that like the dominant factor. I mean, he certainly had a strong belief in kingship. Um, he expected to be obeyed the way that he had obeyed his brother, and he'd done so, like had done a lot, sacrificed a lot for his brother, and to like always support him, and he always had this idea that the king is the absolute head, and that he should, he was a very, very strong believer in what he saw as traditional monarchy. I was just sort of qualifying that a bit because I think it's true that like it's almost like with divine right of kings, like if you have to say it's it's not going to work. It's like if you have to say, you know believe, like, just kings are meant to be obeyed kind of thing. In another, I think unfortunately, if you're at that point where you're sort of saying kings have to be obeyed, unless you're willing to follow through, um, people might not obey you, right? So he did have a very strong conviction in in kingly power, and that he ought to be sovereign. He ran into trouble. His main two things was that he ran into trouble over when he tried to introduce the toleration. He kind of alienated his base, which was actually these Anglican Tories who had supported him on the grounds that he was the legitimate heir the whole time. But then he came along saying, well, and we're going to have like religious toleration, which means we're going to just legitimize all these groups, not just Catholics, but also all these smaller Protestant groups. And there was a few bishops refused to read out the Edict of Toleration, which is what he asked them to do. So like the Anglican Church was very much part of the state, and whenever the king had something to impart to the people, he would ask the bishop and the ministers to read out whatever it was. So he'd ask them to read this out, saying, okay, we're doing what my brother promised. We're now bringing in official toleration. But that meant that the Anglicans would now no longer be it left it open to question. Like he said, he would keep the Anglican Church, but they were going to now have a whole bunch of legal competitors, which they didn't really like, right? So then they rebelled against him, and he had them arrested, but then they were let go by the judge, and that was kind of a slap in the face. But the real problem came again when his son was born. So to the question about like what is the sort of essence of the private life of James II. I think my publishers were hoping for a lot of like bodice ripping and stuff, and I was like wanted to tell James's story and talk about his, I mean, celebrate how great he actually, especially as Duke of York and during the English Civil Wars, what a hero he was. How he fought the Fire of London, led the fight against the Fire of London, how he fought against the Dutch and won, how he supported his father, how he, during like all these sort of heroic things that he did. I was a great patron of the arts. How he was the most he saw more plays than any monarch. He was the greatest patron of the theater, which was restored during the Restoration. The theaters famously were closed under the Puritans and reopened under Charles II. And James, as his second in command, was this amazing patron of the arts. So I wanted to tell all that, but I also wanted to explain about his conversion and kind of celebrate this person who is swept under the rug, right? Because he is just this kind of inconvenient person who, I mean, when I remember being taught about James II in history class, and they basically said, oh yeah, and then there was a brother, he was a Catholic, that wasn't on. So then there was this warming pan baby thing, and forget about him, right? And then they went on to the next thing. So the warming pan baby was essentially every time his wife got pregnant, Mary of Modena, the Whigs would start a rumor that there was going to be a supposititious heir, which is like a fake heir that was going to be sneaked in. Like, so they were saying she's not fertile, she can't really get pregnant. It's going to be a
That's
fake
interesting.
baby. And so, but when when it would turn out to be a girl, which happened a couple of times, suddenly the rumors would go away because it didn't matter. It only
Yeah.
mattered if it were a male, right? So then they had this lie ready to go when she did give birth to a son, James Francis Edward, and suddenly there was this like just explosion of pamphlets and speeches and parades and screaming, pretending that the baby had been brought in like a pan, a warming pan, which is just a copper pan about this big, right? That
Yeah.
goes into the bed, and it's like it looks like a frying pan or something. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, and the whole room was filled with people who he'd actually brought in because of this rumor, right? He had brought in all these people, but unfortunately, the Whigs refused to look at the bed. So they had their backs turned during the whole thing. So this, yeah, poor Prince James, Prince of Wales, from the moment of his birth and from beforehand, he was kind of obfuscated by this cloud of lies, and he was described as a changeling, which of course, like,
Yeah.
taps into people's ancient, the sense of the uncanny child, this.
They're cuckolded by fairies, essentially,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
cradle swapped at birth.
yeah. So he
It's
was described in those terms. I mean, it's awful, right? So they had to sneak him out, like when then William of Orange landed with as big a force as William the Conqueror landed with. I mean, it was an invasion, and it's not described in those terms usually, right? It's described as, and
where did the troops come from? So I was wondering, were the troops all supplied from like the lowlands, or what was going on?
some of them were mercenaries.
Uh,
Yeah, so some of them are from the lowlands, but a lot of them were mercenaries who he'd hired, and he landed with, like, on November 5th with this huge crowd. And James, well, some people think he bottled it. He decided not to fight, but to retreat to France. And he had his reasons, I would say. For one thing, his father had been taken by effectively these same people and executed. He was also worried about, he was very worried about, because he had a few, and this should hit a couple of nerves, hopefully. He had this sort of lieutenant who he had brought up, had at his side from a young boy, and his name was John Churchill, and his father was called Sir Winston Churchill. So he was actually, he is the ancestor of the one that we all know. He made this person. He did everything to bring this person up and to give him everything he wanted, and this person turned on him. So he went off to William of Orange's camp, and so did a couple of other key officers. The army basically stayed mostly behind James, but he then found out that his daughter Anne had gone over to the other camp. And so both of his daughters had gone over to the other camp. I mean, one of them was married to William of Orange, the other openly just betrayed him. And he was just devastated by this. And so, because loyalty was everything to him, and he was a very loyal person himself. Unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of insight into other people's motivations. So, but so when these key betrayals happened, he then decided that instead of having essentially a rematch of the English Civil War, he would retreat to France, and then eventually they fought it out in Ireland, and that's when the Battle of the Boyne happened, and unfortunately, from my perspective, they lost that war. So this another reason that James is not like this, is not touched on as much as it should be, is that it's still sensitive today. What happened in Ireland created what we know as the Orange Men, who are see themselves as like they're loyal to William of Orange still. It created this sort of landscape that we still have in Ireland today. It led to eventually, it led to Scotland losing its separate kingdom status. So I think that the Stuarts, I know for a fact that they had much more popular support in Ireland and Scotland, and also in England. I think that if the Stuarts had remained, I think that it would have been a better outcome for the peoples of the British Isles, because we've seen so much, conflict over the years. Of course, doesn't mean there wouldn't have been any conflict, but so it's a very consequential set of events in many ways, and I think that's why it tends to get passed over, and we don't have like millions of shows like the Tudors.
Yeah. There was that one movie a while back, like The Favorite, about Queen Anne, I think.
Yeah.
And my wife watched that. I remember that. Every now and again, you get it's so weird when you think about it, right? So Mary was the elder child, and Anne was the younger.
Yeah.
And Mary married William of Orange, and it's kind of interesting. I get the sense that had James not allowed his daughters to be converted to Protestantism, then this whole thing wouldn't have happened. But maybe the parliamentary forces were just so powerful that it was sort of a fait accompli by that point anyway.
It was an incredibly hard, like there was just so much prejudice and sort of hysteria, which I think that the Whigs overplayed the whole Catholic element on purpose to try, like they kind of played on these prejudices to try to whip up popular support. And there's always this interplay between the Parliament and the street in London, particularly. That's where we get the term mob, actually, is the vulgus mobile of that period. Because there was this sort of synergy between this faction and the street, and they would use them. They would literally get, like, if there was going to be an important vote, the mob would sometimes kidnap somebody so they couldn't vote. They would prevent them from getting to Parliament. It was a very but we see, I think it's just, I'll just stress in conclusion that I believe, I definitely see the modern party system emerging out of this tension, the Whigs and the Tories around James. we see like over time, especially over the 18th century, that the modern newspaper and therefore media grew up in tandem with these two parties, and we do get like an extension of the vote as well. So the bigger the vote, the more ideological kind of information, the more we have to be informed, as they like to put it, right?
Mm.
The more people who have like that little bit of power, um, the more the oligarchy feels that they need to like herd these people around ideologically. So, you know, the 18th century is a time when there's a lot of media and a lot of like backbiting and sarcasm. I mean, it gets very intense during that period, and a lot of it, I think, is back to the Don Quixote thing. It's like an effort to laugh away, ridicule the old, the beauty and sacredness of the old arrangement of the altar and throne. So that's how, yeah.
I guess this kind of, I can segue this here to our last 10 or 15 minutes on this topic. I mean, what do you think a modern reader should be looking for in these figures? I mean, obviously, this, from my point of view, this is important because I believe that the pre-modern conception of the political is in some sense more real than than the modern or postmodern, and or at least how we conceptualize the postmodern, because I think true postmodernism resembles pre-modern thought. But what do you think, a modern reader, how should they approach this period? What should they be looking for in these figures that you're writing about?
I mean, I think this period again, I think this period is very fresh because it does like lead to, very much has set the terms of where we are. So we as you're right that sovereigns then were actual sovereigns, and so they're interesting for that reason. That they're not just like putting on a show for a kind of more subtle power uh, behind the scenes. And we're always, I mean, they're, interestingly, the Tudors, everybody knows like about the Tudors, and the Stuarts are the like are the ones who were trying to get attention. But and it's kind of a running joke in these like kind of uh, Stuart history circles that we're always being overshadowed by these people. But I think one of the reasons that they that the Tudors start being interesting to people is that they kind of emerge as personalities much more strongly than medieval, just because of the kind of for one thing, the kind of art that we have, the kind of the stories that the literature associated, but also like just we have very strong portraiture. We have and things start to think like it's like the royal family is always kind of like a theater. It was always constructed like a theater where that everybody could watch. And the weird thing about today is that the modern royal families tend to be, I mean, it's certainly especially true of the Windsors, is that they are this like show, as in Curtis Yarvin says, that they're like an upscale, um,
Yeah,
what are they called?
the
The
classy Kardashians, he
Classy
calls them.
Kardashians, yeah. That, but it's, people can sense that there's something empty there because they put on a great show, but they're not actually sovereign. It's monarchy is a misnomer, right?
Mhm.
Because they're not a single ruler, they don't rule, so there's no real monarchy. There's just
I mean, not only are they not even sovereign, just kind of less than no political power just emanates from that section of the British government.
yeah.
They literally are an entertainment product.
Yeah, and that's what after going through the English Civil Wars, where we had a bunch of people trying to and who did abolish the monarchy, they kind of realized, I guess the British people like to have a monarch, but what we want is somebody who can just be a symbol, and we can like a seal of approval for our decisions that we make. But the drama of this, especially in the 17th century, is playing out like this fight between actual, actual monarchs and and this sort of no emerge like, I guess we can argue to the degree that it's new, but it was new at the time, an emergent and growing oligarchy that eventually did win the day, right? Um, and so it is a fascinating drama, and I think that's what modern readers should be, that should be watching. But these people just had like very glorious lives. They were
Mm.
educated from a young age to be rulers. They were worthy. They may have had their personal problems, but it is like the personal is very much to the fore, and I think that's more real. That's a more real way to be ruled by somebody, a real person who's accountable, and who is at the kind of center of what would used to be called the great chain of being, right? This
Yeah.
actual person, and so I think they are in many ways models. I think because they were educated to a high degree of virtue. Um, they had incredible when they were tutored, they learned incredible amounts. I think it's for people, especially for people who aspire, to something, to be leaders, for example, right? That studying these people is very worthwhile. Uh, the Duke of Newcastle, who was the tutor to Charles the Second and James the Second when they were young, and was also a English Civil War commander, wrote a book which is kind of like it is like a mirror for princes. It
Mhm.
is a book um, on ruling England, which was presented to Charles the Second after his father had been executed, and um, he was in exile and had no power at all. But William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, wrote this book for him, and it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to find. I do have a copy. Which I can, if anyone's interested. It's just I also did a video on it on my channel. But yeah, it's called An English Prince in the and and it's a lot of great advice about ruling England from somebody who actually educated Charles II.
That's something that we don't talk about enough. Is that, we talk a lot about these sort of worthy men, these men of the old world. Obviously, when I say men of the old world, I usually mean someone like my grandfather, who was born in Europe before World War II and fought in World War II. But this is even more old. But we don't talk. It's probably even more aristocratic too, where it certainly is. We don't talk a lot about the education that goes into these men either, and that's a large component of it.
Yeah, yeah. And this book gives us a sense of exactly what it is that they learned. I did cover it in the Private Life of James II. It's really a biography. It's just a biography with an
Mm.
emphasis on. I mean, it tells the whole story, but emphasis on the personal and his nature and his um, loves and his convictions.
No, but that's essential, right? Because I think to understand politics, you have to understand the person. Politics is personal, and that's one of the key understandings that postmodernism resurrected out of the pre-modern understanding. So to understand the person of the king is to understand, a large amount of what his reign implied. And that's the same way, like when one of the reasons James was James, according that I learned today, was that he had read the biography of Henry VIII
Yeah.
and found it wanting in several key dimensions, right? So there's that whole component as well.
Yeah, I think this is one of the key points of interest about James is that he did have this. He does kind of bookend Henry VIII, and he has this special relationship with him where he thought about him a lot. He's very critical of him. He wanted to like correct him, but he also had this. But as I say, like he didn't. He had a kind of recognition that things had changed over the last 150 years or so, where it wouldn't just be a matter of saying, okay, well, we're Catholic again. It's going to have to be a longer process than that. I think he knew that was, reality. So
Yeah, that's as excellent. I really look forward to reading the book. The link to your book is in the description. If people want to order it, it's the website's Pen and Sword, which is really nice. I highly recommend. I've read your books previously, and they're quite entertaining and elucidating. So, yeah, is there any other thoughts you want to? I have, unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of a short live stream. I can't do super chats because I have a hard stop in 5 minutes. But is there anything else? Any other thoughts you want to leave us about this period? What brought you to it, and any other projects or where people can find your work in the future?
So the book is available widely now. It's on Amazon. It should be. It came out in the States about a month or so ago, and it should be available through Barnes and Noble and stuff like that. I'm writing a new book about Mary of Modena, who was James's second wife, and has a distinction of being England's only Italian queen. She came from a very interesting family, the d'Estes, who are northern Italian, and also a lot of them ruled in Germany as well. But a very fascinating woman who, after James died in 1701, she actually had to be the kind of emblem and a beacon, I guess, for the Jacobites. So she had quite a story after that. But yeah, I've got my YouTube channel. You can also, there's a playlist on the Jacobites and the English Civil War if any people want an introduction or to the period. Yes, I hope to be making more videos soon, but my time has been consumed with these projects.
Oh, I know how that feels. Well, yes, thank you so much, Justine, for coming on the show. Welcome at any time to talk about your books and about this very interesting part of history. And I hope to have you on the next time to talk about this new book about James's wife, which seems like another really hidden avenue of history that not many people know about.
Guess those Stuarts out there.
Yes.
Appreciate
Thank,
it.
of
Thank you
course.
so much for having me on.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, guys. And thanks for joining us for this very early stream. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.